All right, let's go. Number 10. Red ochre war paint, the ritual that rewired the soldier's brain. In burial sites across Europe, Africa, and the Americas, archaeologists consistently find one substance associated with violent death and weapons: red ochre, iron oxide, a mineral pigment producing deep red when applied to skin. Its use as body paint dates to at least 100,000 years before present, documented at Blombos Cave in South Africa. In numerous prehistoric burials, individuals interred with weapons, showing skeletal trauma, are found with red ochre staining on their bones, painted at or near the time of death. But here is where anthropology and neuroscience converge. Red pigment applied to skin triggers a measurable physiological response. A 2005 study by Russell Hill and Robert Barton, published in Nature, found that athletes wearing red in direct combat sports won at statistically significant higher rates than opponents in other colors, across multiple sport categories and multiple Olympic Games. Exposure to red elevates testosterone and increases aggressive response. The prehistoric warriors who painted themselves red were not decorating themselves. They were self-medicating with a physiologically active stimulus, identified empirically tens of thousands of years before the neurological mechanism was documented. The pigment is in burial sites across 6 continents. The warriors are dust. The neurological mechanism that made it work is identical in every person alive today. Number 9. The Aztec death whistle, engineering terror at the frequency of human screaming. In 1999, archaeologist Lorena Mendoza found a ceramic skull-shaped object in the hands of a sacrifice skeleton near Mexico City. Catalogued decades earlier as a decorative ornament, it had been in museum storage, unexamined since the 1960s. Mendoza blew through it. Acoustic analysis confirmed the death whistle produces frequencies concentrated in the 250 to 4,000 Hz range, the precise range of human auditory maximum sensitivity, overlapping with the frequency profile of mortal screaming. Listeners in controlled studies report elevated heart rate, increased cortisol, and fight-or-flight activation before they can rationally evaluate what they are hearing. The amygdala responds before the prefrontal cortex does. Aztec warriors deployed these en masse before battle, hundreds simultaneously. But here is where the engineering precision cannot be dismissed as accident. The whistle's interior geometry involves a specific cavity shape, aperture dimension, and channel configuration, producing the output frequencies described. This was not achieved by carving any random shape. It required iterative refinement toward a specific acoustic target. Someone experimented until they found the shape with maximum physiological impact. They knew what they were building. They described the result in different language. The whistle is in the National Anthropology Museum in Mexico City. Listen to a recording with headphones in a quiet room. Pay attention to what your amygdala does before your prefrontal cortex gets involved. Number 8. Assyrian impalement displays. Terror architecture as strategic communication. Between approximately 883 and 612 BCE, the Assyrian Empire dominated the ancient Near East, from modern Iran to Egypt. The palace reliefs of kings Ashur-nasir-pal II, Shalmaneser III, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal depict in carved detail the treatment of conquered populations. Impalement on stakes along roads, heads arranged in geometric patterns on city walls, systematic displays positioned at specific heights and orientations. These are not scenes of chaotic battlefield aftermath. They are organized, systematically positioned displays, constructed communications. But here is where the Assyrian approach reveals its full strategic logic. The Assyrians maintained meticulous campaign records, documenting which cities submitted without resistance and which required siege. Cities and regions where previous campaigns produced visible deterrent displays submitted at higher rates in subsequent campaigns. The Assyrians were running a documented natural experiment in the relationship between displayed consequence and subsequent compliance. The palace reliefs were placed specifically so that foreign dignitaries and ambassadors entering the palace would see them. The terror architecture extended from the conquered roads into the reception halls of the capital itself. The reliefs are in the British Museum. The strategic logic embedded in their placement has been studied by military historians for over a century. Number 7. Scythian skull cups, the performance of invulnerability. The Scythians dominated the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea from approximately 700 to 300 BCE. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described a practice dismissed as exaggeration until archaeological confirmation. Scythian warriors drank from the skulls of particularly worthy enemies. Cleaned, lined with leather or gold depending on the warrior's status, used as drinking vessels in ritual and social contexts. Modified human skulls matching this description have been confirmed archaeologically at Scythian sites. This is categorized as ritual. It was also, in operational context, psychological warfare at sophisticated level. But here is where the strategic function becomes clear. The practice was performed in full visibility of enemies, allies, and subject populations. In a cultural context where proper handling of the dead carried enormous ritual significance, demonstrating total disregard for those norms communicated something specific. The practitioner operated outside the framework of consequences constraining ordinary people. An enemy who operates outside your framework of consequences is more psychologically destabilizing than one within it. You can predict adversaries constrained by the same rules. The Scythians communicated deliberately that they were not. The psychological mechanism they exploited, destabilization through visible norm violation, is documented in modern military psychology under different terminology. Number 6. Alexander at Gaugamela. Manufactured inaction as a battle weapon. On October 1st, 331 BCE, Alexander III faced Darius III at Gaugamela in modern northern Iraq. Approximately 47,000 Macedonians against a Persian force of 90,000 to 120,000. The night before, Alexander's commanders recommended a night attack to offset the numerical disadvantage. Alexander refused. The dramatic account presents this as chivalric nobility. The operational reality was calculated. A night attack with 47,000 men against a larger force would dissolve unit cohesion immediately. The Macedonian tactical advantage, the coordinated oblique advance of the companion cavalry, required clear visual communication between Alexander and his unit commanders. Darkness eliminated that. But here is where Alexander's psychological operation comes into focus. Darius, anticipating the night attack his own commanders would have recommended, kept his army awake in battle formation through the entire night. By the time Alexander engaged at dawn, the Macedonians had slept. The Persians had not. The refusal of the night attack was itself the attack. By doing nothing visible, Alexander produced a specific physical and psychological state in the Persian force that preceded and shaped the battle. The subsequent engagement, Alexander's oblique cavalry charge creating a gap in the Persian line, driving toward Darius himself, causing the emperor to flee, was decided in part by a decision made the previous night to let an army destroy itself with vigilance. Number 5. Roman decimation. Calculated terror directed at your own army. Decimation. From the Latin decimatio, the removal of a tenth, was a Roman military punishment in which a unit that fled or mutinied was divided into groups of 10. Within each group, lots were drawn. The soldier who drew the short lot was beaten to death by the other 9. Applied rarely, deliberately. But here is where the psychological engineering reveals its precision. The probability structure was specific, 10%. High enough to be a genuine deterrent, low enough that survival was the probable outcome. A soldier contemplating retreat faced a calculation. Certain exposure to enemy action in flight versus a 10% chance of execution by comrades. Decimation changed the risk calculation of retreat from a survival strategy into a gamble with worse expected value than standing and fighting. The punishment was also inflicted by comrades, not by command authority. This was not incidental. Soldiers who had beaten a comrade to death under decimation were not easily going to advocate retreat in the next engagement. The procedure created social and psychological bonds through shared perpetration, reinforcing unit cohesion in subsequent actions. Last confirmed application: Marcus Licinius Crassus against forces that fled during the Spartacus Revolt, 71 BCE. Military psychologists studying unit cohesion under stress document similar dynamics today under different labels. Number 4. Mongol advanced scouts. deploying traumatized witnesses as weapons. Before a Mongol army arrived at a major city, it was typically preceded by survivors of earlier attacks, specifically selected, given horses, and directed toward the next target. Documented by Matthew Paris, Ibn al-Athir, and the Franciscan monk Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, who traveled to the Mongol court in 1245. These were not accidental survivors. They were selected and deployed. The witnesses arrived weeks before the army with first-hand accounts of what had happened to cities that resisted: systematic destruction, mass killing, obliteration. Their own physical state, wounds, terror, was the most convincing evidence of what was coming. But here is where the operation's precision becomes most apparent. The Mongols were also highly selective about which cities they destroyed and which they preserved intact, rewarding rapid submission with complete protection and continuation of existing administrative structures. The contrast was itself a communication the approaching witnesses amplified. The message was not simply that the Mongols were powerful. It was that submission produced a specific positive outcome. Resistance produced a specific negative outcome, and the choice was entirely the defenders to make. This converted psychological pressure from a stimulus for desperate resistance into a calculation in which submission was the rational option. The Mongol advance scouts were not propaganda. They were data delivery. Number 3. Hannibal at Cannae, the manufactured route that produced the greatest encirclement in ancient history. On August 2nd, 216 BCE, Hannibal Barca commanded approximately 50,000 troops against approximately 86,000 Romans at Cannae in southern Italy. The largest army Rome had ever fielded, assembled specifically to end the war in a single engagement. Hannibal placed his weakest troops, Gallic and Spanish infantry, in the center, and his best, African heavy infantry, on the flanks. The Roman infantry pushed forward in the center exactly as planned, driving the weaker troops back. The Carthaginian center visibly bent inward. Romans surged forward in pursuit. But here is where the psychological dimension becomes inseparable from the tactical one. What the Roman commanders watched was a controlled withdrawal rehearsed to look like a rout. As Roman infantry poured forward, certain of victory, the African heavy infantry on the flanks wheeled inward. The pursuing Roman force, psychologically certain it was winning, ran into an encirclement closing from 3 sides. Approximately 47,000 to 70,000 Romans died in a single afternoon in an area of roughly 1 square kilometer. The psychological manipulation that produced this outcome was the manufactured appearance of defeat, a visual cue triggering the precise behavioral response Hannibal had designed his formation to produce. He did not defeat the Roman army. He induced the Roman army to defeat itself. Cannae is still studied in military academies worldwide. Number 2. The Spartan Crypteia, state-sponsored terror as social engineering. The Crypteia, described by Plutarch in his Life of Lycurgus, sent selected Spartan youths into the Laconian countryside at night, armed with knives, with authorization to kill helots, the enslaved population, at their own discretion. Target selection was specific: helots who appeared physically strong, confident, or capable of leadership. The helots outnumbered Spartan citizens approximately 7-1. The Crypteia was not a reaction to a specific threat. It was a standing institution operating continuously. But here is where the psychological engineering is most precise. Random, unpredictable, authorized violence targeted specifically at individuals displaying confidence, strength, or leadership capacity produces one behavioral outcome in the surviving population: suppression of the display of exactly those characteristics. Over generations, a population subject to this predation developed social norms actively discouraging visible capability, because visible capability was the selection criterion for lethal targeting. This is not theory. Modern research on populations subject to sustained, unpredictable state violence documents exactly this pattern: behavioral and cultural suppression of visible individual distinction as a survival strategy. The helot population never successfully revolted against Sparta despite their numerical advantage. They outnumbered their enslavers 7-1. The Crypteia is part of the reason. Number 1. The Assyrian propaganda machine, the first documented information warfare campaign. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, 911 to 609 BCE, was not only a military superpower, It was the first civilization to deploy what modern analysts would recognize as a systematic multi-channel information warfare campaign at imperial scale. Royal annals, detailed narrative accounts of military campaigns in standardized language emphasizing Assyrian victory, enemy atrocity, and divine mandate, were inscribed on palace walls, clay cylinders buried in building foundations, steles at conquered cities, and prisms distributed to temples across the empire. The visual program of palace reliefs, impalement displays, battle scenes, tribute processions, was the visual component of the same campaign. Text and image reinforced each other across multiple media simultaneously. But here is where the strategic sophistication reveals itself most clearly. The campaign targeted multiple audiences with differentiated messages. Throne room reliefs targeted foreign dignitaries entering the palace, delivering invincibility at the moment of maximum psychological vulnerability. Foundation cylinders targeted future generations, establishing the historical narrative before it could be contested. Steles at conquered cities targeted those populations directly. Different channels, different audiences, different message emphases, coordinated toward a single strategic objective: the inevitability of Assyrian domination and the rationality of preemptive submission. The empire collapsed in 609 BCE when Babylon and Media destroyed Nineveh. The information campaign that sustained it for 3 centuries did not prevent the fall. But the palace reliefs are in the British Museum, and the operational structure of what the Assyrians built has been reinvented, independently, by every information-dominant power since. 10 psychological operations. 10 demonstrations that breaking an enemy's mind before breaking their body is not a modern invention. It is as old as organized conflict. Red ochre that elevated testosterone 100,000 years before the mechanism was documented. An acoustic weapon tuned to the exact frequency of mortal screaming. Impalement displays, positioned with architectural precision for maximum visibility. Skull cups, communicating supernatural immunity. A deliberately withheld night attack that destroyed an army through its own vigilance. A 10% execution probability, calculated to make retreat more dangerous than combat. Traumatized survivors, deployed as data delivery. A manufactured route, producing the most complete encirclement in ancient military history. State predation, targeting visible leadership in a population 7 times larger than its enslaver. And a multi-channel information campaign with differentiated messages across an empire. The specific technologies have changed, the psychological mechanisms they targeted have not. The amygdala that responded to the death whistle before conscious processing could occur is identical to the one operating in every person alive today. The risk calculation that decimation manipulated is still the calculation soldiers make. The social suppression the Cryptea engineered is still the outcome researchers observe in populations subject to unpredictable authorized violence. The ancient world did not have the vocabulary of cognitive bias, threat response, or information operations. What it had was accumulated empirical observation across generations, the record of what caused enemies to flee, what caused populations to comply, what caused soldiers to hold when every instinct said run. That accumulated knowledge produced the death whistle, the skull cup, the deliberate inaction before Gaugamela, the withdrawal that looked like a rout, and a Spartan youth sent into the dark with a knife. The mind has always been the primary target. The weapons aimed at it have simply been rebuilt in each generation's available materials. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.